Hello and welcome to the Azad project. I'm Rayan,
I'm Moo.
and with us today is our friend Zarin.
Hi.
And today we're going to talk about a particularly difficult topic.
Yeah.
Right? We're going to talk about policing. And it's essentially a response to, in light of the recent events that's going down in Minnesota following the death of George Floyd.
Yeah, I mean, so 3 days ago, George Floyd was murdered by a police officer who knelt on his neck for 7 minutes while he was begging for air or water. The whole thing was captured on film, and it's really tough.
It's some heavy stuff.
Tough to, and it's not tough as in like, oh, we shouldn't be talking about this or whatever. It's tough because it's so frustrating, because it's just happened so often, all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And you watch it, and like, if you've seen the video, you watch it with this like ultimate sense of hopelessness, because there's a huge crowd of people who are watching this man die, and they're asking the police, can you just get off of his neck? There are people there who have martial arts training, and they're saying, you can't do that, that is going to kill him. There are people who are warning them of what their actions are going to be. They're being filmed the whole time, and these policemen, they're like a wall. They have no emotion or reaction. They don't care. They're just doing a job. It's just so heartbreaking and hopeless. The entire time you just feel hopeless about it, right?
And you can really feel the hopelessness through the audience who was there. It felt unreal, right? And the frustrations that you talk about, you could just feel them feeling it as well. Like, you know how one of the people went there asking if they could call the police on the police.
Yeah.
You can't, like, I mean, it's just so bizarre
There's
that
no,
there
yeah.
would be even the position like
And
that.
at the same time as well, right? Like we feel that hopelessness here in Australia, right? Where the police are a different situation to what you have in the States. They're a lot less blatant. The police in the US are very blatant about their abilities and their power.
Yeah, it's a cultural thing.
I was watching the video with a friend of mine, and he said, if I was there, I would just tackle the cop and run away as fast as I could. And I just, like...
That's interesting.
We feel that hopelessness, but we can't even imagine the feeling of the fear that you would feel as a black person in that situation where you're watching another black person being knelt on by a cop. Like, think of...
See, that's the thing. You can't even be self-defensive with cops, right? Because they have the legal mandate to do it. And just because they have the quote-unquote legal mandate, they seem to be able to get away with everything.
Yeah.
And like they don't need any other justification to do anything. They're just gonna keep getting away. And the fact that it was all being filmed, the brutality of it all, and the cops in the video just remained so unfazed, so unmoved by the pleas as he was dying,
Yeah.
and as he was saying that he couldn't breathe, they just didn't respond to it. And even though the people around were filming it, they still weren't afraid of the consequences of being filmed because they knew they were gonna get away with it.
The other guy on the scene, he just kept saying, "This is why you don't do drugs." That's it. That's all they have to say, right? As if this is some large message, to the community.
You're gonna get a knee to your neck if you do drugs.
Well, that's profiling 101, isn't it? You just see the person and you just assume that they do drugs, for example.
Exactly, 100%.
Yeah, I think that really ties us into the whole racial dimension of policing in America, right? It's one thing to say that all cops are bastards, but then tying it onto how cops are particularly bastards towards minorities and black people in America.
Yeah.
It's just, you can't not isolate the relationship of the racial motivations in
Yeah, of course.
The actions of the cops.
I do want to say as well, right, just on the whole don't do drugs thing, right? Even if he was in that moment on crack or whatever, so what, right? Where does this moralistic sense of judgment come from where it's even if he was a drug offender, the acts that occurred, no one's deserving of that, right? Why do we think that this form of punishment is acceptable under any circumstances, right? I don't know. George Floyd was a good person, right? And we know that, and it's been shared all over liberal media, that he was a good person. But even if he wasn't, he doesn't deserve that kind of outcome. That's the primary issue is, it doesn't matter, right? If you're a good person or a bad person, no one's deserving of that kind of stuff, but we normalize it so much.
And I think the normalization sort of comes from the fact that we've seen this before. If we think about the murder of Eric Garner in
Yeah.
2014, right? It was almost the exact same thing. He was also saying, I can't breathe, and so was George Floyd. It's just so bizarre to me that the same thing can happen over and over again. And like, even the response to it, right? Like Black Lives Matter really got steam after the death of Eric Garner.
Yeah.
And that's when you saw riots and protests after it, and we're seeing riots and protests right now. But here's the thing: it'll trend on Twitter for a couple of days, and then, as we know, it'll fade away. It always fades away, and the status quo just finds so much comfort in the fact that it will fade away.
I'll say, like, it fades away for the observers, no doubt, right? But as we see what's happening in Minnesota now, what happened in Ferguson in 2014 after Michael Brown was shot there, the people who are there, who live in that terror, it doesn't go away from them, right? And so you see the outcome of that in these riots now in Minnesota, where it is their only form of recourse. Their only form of recourse is, I guess, kind of a chaotic anarchy, because they don't have any protection from the systems that are meant to protect them. They are victims of their protection rather than actually like benefiting off of their protection. So when you have that like intense hopelessness, in those situations, they have no choice but to riot. For the rest of us observing the discourse around these people, there's like 2 days of talking about why cops are bad, and then there's 2 weeks of talking about why rioting is bad and how that damages the optics of the African American population or whatever.
Yeah, like we're talking about our frustration sitting here in Australia, thousands of miles isolated from the community that experiences this sort of brutality. But we feel the anger. I can't imagine what the people in Minnesota right now, the black people in Minnesota right now, feel about the whole thing, right? I was watching a video on the riots that are unfolding in Minnesota, and there was a man who was choking on the smoke from the tear gas that's in the air, and he was just bawling his eyes out about how it could have been him in place of George Floyd, or like it could have been his brother, it could have been anyone that he knows. And I think that's the other thing. It does, like, the racial aspect, right? It's the murderers of George Floyd didn't care that it was George Floyd or it was an individual. They sort of, the dehumanization that goes on when they see, because as Zarin pointed out, the racial profiling that goes on as well. Mm-hmm. Like it's sort of entirely independent, their humanity, from, and like they just view them as a criminal, and that's it. That's that.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching the Patriot Act today with Hassan Minaj, and Kamala Harris was in there.
Yeah, okay.
And he asked her about it, and even like it's so institutionalized, the racialization, that even a senator is saying, "Oh yeah, it's so tough, but black and brown men are always profiled by the police." Like it's like a known fact that yes, it's happening in America.
Yeah, of course.
It's kind of ironic that it came from Kamala Harris, though.
Yeah.
Because she's a fucking bootlicker who legislated laws as an attorney general, which sort of she was at the very position to make.
I mean, half of the Democratic candidates were prosecutors or had some police force history. I mean, the link to Amy Klobuchar and the man who murdered George Floyd, she had the chance to put him away for killing a Native American man, however many years ago now, and she did not prosecute him for that, and now he killed another man.
Well, that's my problem with the liberal side of like the Democratic Party, right? They're always talking about these topics, especially during the election years, and then suddenly when the votes are in, they just change and they become their institutionalized selves.
Yeah, and I think the fact that black people have always been sort of the Democratic base and they've just been taken for granted. Yeah. Like we saw what Biden just you guys have seen Biden saying that you ain't black if you're gonna consider voting for Trump, and it just shows the audacity and like just the caucasity really of these people who in positions of power within the Democratic base who just think that like black people are just gonna keep voting for them.
Of course, they take them for granted, no doubt about it. I just want to say, like, back on the racial point, right? Like, yeah, we're far away from what's happening in the States. So, like, talking about that is kind of odd. Australia's police has as much of a racial history. I mean, a racial present. Like, the history here is something that is remarkably disgusting and disturbing to talk about. Yeah. So much so that, I mean, in 1991, they had the Royal Commission on Aboriginals and their representation by the in incarceration and whatnot. They had a Royal Commission into how Aboriginals were treated by police. Mm-hmm. Since 1991, there have been 440 deaths in custody of Aboriginal people, of which 40% were just from police refusing to give them medication. I was reading a story about an elder Mr. Ward, he was kept in the back of a van for a number of hours. The temperature got up to about 50 degrees inside the van, completely a full metal van. He died, and the coroner said he was cooked to death. Slow and painful, right? These situations, like, you can't separate policing from just racial profiling. They are inherently linked. Australia, like, I think it's easy to look at a lot of issues and be like, man, America's a fucked up place. But really, these are issues that are just inherent to the systems of it. And so you see them anywhere you have those things.
Yeah.
And I'm sure if you look at the UK as well, you'd find similar instances.
Absolutely.
The benefit of Australia is that the police tend to be less blatant about it. But in any situation where we can't see them, they're doing the same shit the American police are doing. The American police are just more in the open about it for whatever reason. But it's no different in Australia, right? We're not removed from it in that regard.
Yeah. I think it sort of really shows you the structural aspects of it all.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's just so frustrating to see the pervasiveness of it. And it just, because it's a systematic issue that we're going to discuss more, it's just, the response.
That's the thing, right? It's like, it's a systematic issue so that even if you had a fully representative, police force of like 50% black people or 100% black people, that still wouldn't stop the police brutality. It would reduce it significantly, no doubt about it, right? But racism is not the input, it is perpetuated by the system. Yeah. It's something that, like, even in situations where you have, like, in Pakistan, where you have Pakistani police attacking Pakistani people, or in India with the protests that happened there after the citizenship thing, like, there's a racial axis to this whole thing. But if you were to remove all the races from the police force, it still wouldn't stop the issues with the police force because it's so much deeper than that, right?
Yeah, you talk about representation, right? And I think that's one of the liberal talking points when it comes to policing and all that. Mm-hmm. The typical liberal approach would be to say, hey, just get more black cops and you'll be done with the whole issue. But see, the liberals fail to address the systematic aspects of it.
Yeah.
And you see it in their responses to the riots as well. They've been so dismissive about the looting that's been going on and the rioting and the damage to property.
To insured private property.
And to Target, who is a union-busting big $60 billion corporation.
Yeah, and in Macca's. Like, where these people draw their moral lines and their value lines, it's despicable. And the fact they can't look at themselves and be like, a Target is a fine trade for the life of a man. How do they draw these lines and think it's okay?
It's bizarre. And I mean, I can't help but blame liberal media to a certain degree as well. Because if we think about cultural hegemony, right? Like, I'm drawing on Gramsci over here. But when we think of how pervasive the narrative is that cops are good, and that there are bad people out there, and that these good cops must tackle these bad people and, like, make things better for society. Like, you see it in Hollywood all the fucking time. Like, the fact that Die Hard is it's considered to be one of the greatest movies out there.
Yeah, and the amount of just, like, garbage shows you can watch all the,
dude,
like cops.
Brooklyn Nine-Nine is the biggest show right now. And it's about how cops are great and how, like, good people being cops can make a difference in society and all that, right? It's just this romanticized perception of how cops are a good force out in the world.
Yeah, totally. There's an inability that we have where just because of the world that we live in, right? We don't know how to draw the line between police and safety. And so, like, our culture dictates, our media dictates that we are safe because we have police. They prevent people smashing in our windows and stealing our goods and whatnot. When you look at the actual situations of where police actually do their roles like that, it doesn't really happen. If you have something stolen from your house and you call the police, most likely they will report it and then it will be forgotten about because it's not important. If you own a business and you are robbed and you call the police, you will be protected. There will be some form of repercussion for whoever it took from you because that's what they're there for, right? Like,
or if you're a homeless man trying to sleep on a park bench, you're going to be moved from there because you're in a public space and you can't do that.
Moved if you're not arrested. And you see that, like, I remember in Sydney, there was a huge public square in the city was turned into a homeless camp where there was a bunch of tents and a food kind of kitchen set up there. And the police just came in and pushed everyone out. It's despicable, right?
So you're talking about Sydney, right? And how the homeless camp was just moved away.
Yeah.
And so like it's easy for us to say over here, sitting in our high apartment in Melbourne,
Yeah.
and just saying that that is objectively bad, and that we would like to think that if we were there, we would have tried to do something different, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, you have so little agency to act against the brutality of the police force, right? If the homeless people living in the homeless camp tried to act out, they would have been shot, they would have been arrested. Like, I mean, they're treated as the scum of society anyway, so no one would really even notice
Yeah.
if they were gone. That's the sort of rationale that the police force is perpetuating out there. And so, like, I want to tie this into the agency of the American people and their act of rioting that's going on in Minnesota right now, right? What other option did they really have?
Yeah, of course.
Right? They've been pushed into a corner where, like, I mean, they have so little political power. And I'm not just talking about the average Black American person. I'm talking about the average person there.
Yes.
They don't have the ability to go out of their way and make some sort of change. So I am very sympathetic of their of them channeling all their angers, all their frustrations into a sort of violent sort of reaction, right, where it all just manifests.
Yeah, you're totally right. They have no other recourse. The liberal approach to changing things is wait until your next local election, get in a different mayor maybe to talk to the police force.
Exactly. I mean, even in that show, like I mentioned with Kamala Harris, she's just saying, "Oh, vote for the person who aligns with your ideology, so that you can be better represented." But things have to be done now.
Yep.
As a senator, what are you doing? And she's like, "Oh, we're just pushing for bills and fighting with Republicans in the Senate, and that's it."
Yeah.
See, that approach, the liberal approach, right, is just so dismissive of the systematic issue that's at the heart of it all.
For sure.
Right? So, like, I mean, we're talking about racism a lot today, right? And so much of the shitty things that are done by the cops, it's sort of just categorized as racist cops, as bad apples, acting independently of the wishes and desires of the good police officers who happen to make up the majority of the police force,
Yeah.
and just giving the whole police force a bad name.
Yeah.
Right? That seems to be the dominant narrative. And not just about amongst liberals, I'd say the average person. See, there's something fundamentally wrong with that approach, because it ignores the structural aspects and the historical legacy of the police forces.
Yeah, totally.
So, right, I think it's important to think of the police force as just enforcers of the law, right? Like, no one's gonna disagree with that definition. But what happens when the laws that are being enforced are shitty laws?
Yeah.
The Jim Crow laws were shitty laws.
Apartheid
And
laws.
Apartheid laws were shitty laws. And the police were behind each and every one of those. They were the ones making sure that these laws were enforced.
Yeah.
So, like, I mean, apart from the moral argument that these laws are just bad, we can just see that the police play an active role in upholding these laws.
Totally.
And when these laws are motivated by racial, when these laws are motivated by racism, the execution of these laws is also going to be racist.
Yeah,
at the end.
definitely. When we we say ACAB, we say all cops are bastards. And what that really means, right, is it doesn't mean, because I've seen people who get really upset because they have like a cousin who's a cop,
Yeah.
and like they're a fine person or whatever, and maybe they're black as well. What we really mean is that the laws are broken. The laws are definitely favored towards one side more than another. The police, the powers that they have, the class privileges that they are granted, are inherently broken. These are all systematic structural issues. If, as an individual, I am a racist, I have a negative perception of black people, and there is a position available where I have more power, and there are laws that are unbalanced towards black people, I will fill that position. I will be incentivized to go and be a cop if I am a racist who wants to abuse my power. We say all cops are bastards because the systems that are inherent to police work incentivize shit people to come into the police work.
And also, I mean, I guess I'll play the devil's advocate over here, right?
Yeah.
You have you can make the argument that, oh, there are some cops which aren't bad. there are some cops who will go out of their way to intervene and make sure that there's no racism in the police force, right? So to that, I would argue that you can be a good person, but you can't be a good cop.
You can't be a good cop.
Because by consenting to join the police force, you're actively participating in upholding a racist system that is always going to be oppressing the weak and always going to be representing the interests of the powerful.
And it's so much more deeply intersectional than that, right? Like, yeah, it's a brokenly racist system, but if you're a woman who is calling and you need some help, you're going to be taken less seriously than a male who's calling. It's a deeply sexist system. It is a grossly classist system. You pretty much the role of the police is to keep poor people in check. It just so happens that they can do that while also being incredibly racist and perpetuating their racist beliefs and desires through that as well. If you are a part of that system, no matter how, if you truly believe that you can change it from the inside or whatever, good on you, I guess.
Yeah.
But until the system is changed, you are a bastard. You're a cop. You're a bastard.
Yeah.
All cops, even your cousin.
Okay, no, I was gonna bring up this point because I'm again gonna play the devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
Let's see. It's just a point that I'm gonna ask you both. A lot of the countries at the moment that are shown to have riots related to race issues, we are seeing that police is enforcing the laws, the institutionalized ideas of policing people, right? But what I personally find very intimidating about American police or like Australian police is that the fact that they carry guns.
Okay.
So it gives them a higher entitlement, and it tells people that they should be very afraid because anything they do, they might just get shot.
Yeah.
Compared to in the UK, when I lived there, they carried sticks, so I still had the idea I could tackle one policeman and leave if I wanted to.
I think that's a really interesting point, right? Because my views on violence and my views on guns have changed a lot over the last year and a bit. You see what's happening in Minnesota, Minneapolis, right? These riots they're violent riots. There are people who are being hurt. And I definitely used to have a really negative perception about the role of guns. And ideally, if no one had guns, that would be good. That would be really great. But we don't live in a world where no one has guns, right? The police do have guns. And evidence shows that if you're a black man who owns a gun in the United States, you're less likely to be shot by police than if you don't own a gun. Because these people are scared. The police are weak as well. They're humans at the end of the day. They're scared. They will exert power if you don't have the power to fight back. The British policeman who carries around a baton and a pepper spray, right? Yeah. He's not going to be as ballsy as an American police officer walking around with an assault weapon.
But that's the whole point.
Yeah.
I want
It's
to
all
circle
power
back
projection.
to the point, the fear factor thing that Zarin just brought up, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that's so real. When I'm out in the streets, right, I'm just minding my own business, doing nothing illegal, just existing. I see a cop car. I will break a sweat.
Yeah.
I will feel nervous. I will feel some sort of an anxiety. And in general, that's just a sentiment you'd see everywhere. And I mean, even when I was back in Bangladesh, the cops weren't carrying as big of the guns as they do over here.
Yeah.
But I would still be terrified whenever I saw the police officers, because I would hear stories of them just planting stuff on you just so they could, make some money off of it.
Yeah.
So I think that fear factor and the fact that they're weaponized and the fear factor comes from the knowledge that we have that they have weapons and that they can use those weapons against us, that they can legitimately use violence on us and get away with it.
Yeah, and there's nothing we can do about it.
There's nothing we can do about it. And this really focuses on, and the key word in that statement is the word legitimate.
Yeah.
Right? Because when we see the riots in Minnesota, a lot of people don't think that that's legitimate.
Yeah.
But when a cop is carrying a gun, when a cop is shooting a robber or arresting a drunk driver, that violence is deemed legitimate.
Yeah.
And so this is where I want to talk about where this legitimacy comes from, right?
Yeah, okay.
So if we are to talk political theory over here, right? So there's this German sociologist / political theorist, Max Weber. So he's a big deal,
Yeah.
but he's known for his definition of the state, right? And how he defines the state and the government really is as the force that has a monopoly on the legitimate use on physical violence in a society. All right, so let's focus on these terms. What he means by monopoly and legitimate violence is that only the state has the authority to be violent in the society that we live in, and that just seems fundamentally wrong to me. It because of like I mean, if you're describing your relationship with the government, who's supposed to be looking out for you in terms of violence, that's just messed up, right?
Yeah.
And because the police, to a certain extent, is just a manifestation of the violent tendencies of the government. Like I mean, it all just goes back to authority and how this authority maintains its power over us as a society. You know?
Yeah.
Like
okay.
it all comes down to violence. They're willing and able to shoot us on sight to retain their power. And like this goes back to your point about carrying guns for our own sake, right, Mo? Like if we can't defend ourselves from being shot at, what are we even doing?
Yeah, do we just accept our death?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really despicable when you see the bootlickers who see these things happen, like George Floyd and whatnot, and they try to justify the like monopoly of violence with a kind of like social contract argument of like, you know, you live in society, so like this is what you have to give up for it. Just follow what they tell you to do and you'll be fine. It doesn't work that way for most people. They don't get that option of just follow what they do and you'll be fine.
The thing about the social contract is that it's always going to be favoring those in power, and it's always going to be favoring those who have written the social contract. And in a sense, in America, it's the white people. Yeah. America is built on a racial history of injustice, right?
Yeah.
And those institutions still exist because there was never a second revolution where you overthrew those racist structures. You just decided to reform those structures through legislation such as the Civil Rights Act. And that's such a fucking liberal approach to politics. You just do some sort of reform and you just think the problems go away. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I guess it's sort of like every episode we sort of find a way ranting about reform versus revolution.
But that's the whole, like, that is the argument of our time. You know, because like people want to be incremental and they believe in slow change. They see things like what's happening in Minnesota as like the complete wrong way of going about it. But what's happening in Minnesota is the outcome of small change. It's the fact that small change does not solve any problems. This is what it results in.
See, the thing is, people that are making these reforms are the ones that are privileged, right?
Yep.
You and I, from a privileged point of view, I know all of us here are people of color, but even though we are from a privileged background, so us talking and us taking the liberal step saying, oh, this is the wrong way to go about it, we don't face the consequences of going at it in a slower pace. They do.
It's true.
This is the whole
we have time. Like, we have the time to wait for slow reform.
Exactly.
A lot of people don't have that kind of time.
And also the point of how reform happens, right? Like how I like to think of reform as just as a sort of minor concession on part of the ruling class on the rest of society.
Yeah.
And like it's always going to be the bare minimum that they're willing to let go of to ensure that the working class doesn't rise up and like get the guillotines out and running.
They're just doing a cost-benefit analysis all the time of what they can offer us, what they can give us.
Yeah, dude, it's fucking 2020 and transphobia is still something.
It's still a thing.
How is like it makes no sense, right?
Dude, the unnecessary gendering of everything is, you know, how do we have blue and pink as boy and girl colors in this fucking year?
I mean, that's the color of the Azad project, right? Yin and
That's
yang,
true.
baby.
Yeah, exactly. I guess kind of like all these discussions about the police, it's difficult to discuss the issues with the police because if you're not offering something else, what are you doing? You're just complaining. And I think most people struggle to visualize what alternatives could be. So they just acquiesce and they just accept, like, this is what things have to be. This is the best case. And if you really want to talk about alternatives, you know, to policing, we have to talk about what policing is for.
Yeah.
And we have to really talk about what crime is and how do we actually go about approaching crime? Because I think, like, we talk about the ruling class, right, and concessions and reform and stuff. Who is the ruling class in the modern day? We don't have a monarchy anymore. The ruling class is who has the agenda-setting power in our governance. They decide what our democracy actually wants to achieve. And we discussed this in the first episode. That's money. Money talks. Money is the agenda-setting power that we have in our society, not democracy, not voting.
Yep.
Lobbying has so much more significance in our policy than democracy ever will. So the ruling class that gives us these concessions, the ruling class that is protected by these concessions, the ruling class who is protected by the police are the rich and the wealthy. Police will always protect the interests of capital under capitalism. In fact, like to discuss getting rid of the police, it's impossible unless you get rid of capitalism. They are inherently linked to each other, right? I think a lot of people think of the police as one of those things that have just always been around.
Yeah.
Like we've always had a group of people protecting the safety of our local areas.
Yeah, and I think this is where having the historical approach to policing is important.
Yeah.
Because you see policing as we know of it in the modern sense emerge in early 19th century England, right? Like I think London was the first city in the world to actually have active policing in the way that we know it today. And it emerged as a sort of response to the needs of the modern urban lifestyle, right?
Yep.
So it's interesting if we put this together with what's happening on a more structural, broader scale, right? Like around that period is when the Industrial Revolution really ramped up, and that's when it was really starting to go at it, and that's where capitalism emerged, where private ownership of property emerged, and that's also when policing emerged as well. And this isn't just correlation and causation over here. It's because we need to understand the police as the protectors of private property. The police is there to ensure that the working class cannot have the political agency to riot and overthrow the ruling class, the capitalist class, and take control of the means of production, right?
Yeah.
And you see it everywhere when the workers are on strike. The police are just going to come down. In the history of labor, right? You've seen the police take actively violent stances against labor and shoot them down quite literally to stop them from striking and to get them to go back to work.
Yeah. I mean, just any form of like labor particularly, but any form of dissent, the police will just come down on it hard. I think about protests a lot, right? Because there's been a lot of protests going on.
Sorry, but except for when you're protesting your right to get a haircut as a southerner in America.
That's very true.
Yeah.
That's
Those
the
white
only
folk with
time-
guns, they just walked up to the
Police
Capitol
didn't
building.
come to stop them down and stop their ranting.
Yeah. I mean, that's just like such a deeply like obvious, racial bias right there.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Like the States is a fake country. It doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
It's a bullshit country. Like the States is not real. We just believe it's real because of our
It can only
social
exist
constructs.
in a neoliberal hellscape and it's just so bizarre.
You truly must live in clown world for America to exist.
I mean, and that's why Trump is their president.
Exactly.
It's just that people like Sanders and Noam Chomsky are still alive, so we still have some kind of...
It's true, but both of those guys are about 2 weeks off. So
Yeah, they're gonna die soon.
Oh
so-
man, it's gonna suck when Chomsky dies.
yeah.
What's that guy?
Well, maybe he'll get shot. Then we can
Well,
do a
he's white,
follow-up.
so
Yeah.
That's true. But he's a dissenter, right? So yeah, okay. So I remember one of my friends, she works at the uni newspaper. She got pepper sprayed in the media section of the protest last year for climate. And like, I think about protests a lot because I used to really like going to protests and I felt very accomplished by doing it. But really all you're doing is just dancing around in the zone they tell you to dance around in, and nothing will change. And if you try to leave that zone at all and actually interfere with anything, you will be taken down.
dude, like I've tried. Do you remember that protest that I organized a couple of years ago? The one in front of State Library.
Yeah, for Bangladesh.
And there was just so much bureaucracy to like actually go out and protest, right? Like I had to seek permission from the police officers to let me protest.
Yeah.
How fucked up is that?
Exactly.
So like if you were to protest the brutality of the police officers, you would need permission from the police officers to be protesting.
Of
to begin
course. Like that's the ludicrousy of kind of our modern activist aesthetic, right? Where it's like, yeah, we're out every week protesting, but what? Like you're not,
Man.
you're just performing,
Just
right?
act.
It's just we have so little agency.
Exactly.
And even that is trampled by the existence of the police force.
And when you like, if you think about like, if I wanted to go out and protest the police right now, that would always look like what's happening in Minnesota. You just cannot do anything less than a riot if you want to be protesting police brutality. You need to be rioting, right? I just get really ticked off when I see people dismissing these riots as like selfish people who are making use of the chaos to get like goods from fucking Target. That's not what this is about.
Yeah, fuck you and fuck Target.
Fuck you and fuck Target.
Yeah.
They're not at a loss here. No. It's just so fucking Trump tweeted he was very sad to see the death of George Floyd. And then as soon as the riot started, he's threatening to send the military into Minneapolis, right? Like, these guys will share their empathy when something bad happens. But if they're ever threatened, they will go in with all the action in the world. They will not do that if a man is killed by police. They're not going to send all the action in the world to prevent the police from killing people. But God forbid the people decides to stand up and not perform in the zone they're allowed to perform in. Mm-hmm. This is what happens, right?
Yeah. Look, I think we've attempted to make the case of why policing is bad and why policing will always be bad, especially when it's the very basis of policing existing is built on coercive, non-consensual hierarchies between the ruling class and everyone else in society, right? So I think I think we should have a discussion on what alternatives that's there, because I think so many people out there, even myself included really, until I decided to look into it more, are confused about what alternatives there are to policing, because they see crime and they see crime as an inevitability in society. And they can't fathom of a society where there isn't a force fighting crime.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really, okay, like there's a lot of things to dig into when it comes to alternatives. The first thing is just very generally, when people are offered a leftist alternative to a current institution, there is an innate intuitive bias that we have where we want to compare the alternative at its worst possible occasion to the current at its best possible occasion, right? Yep. So if we look at the current system in the same way we look at an alternative system through a very cynical, critical lens, Minneapolis, that is what happens with our current system. People will be killed unjustly. There will be no repercussion for it to the people who commit these crimes, the police, and then chaos. That is what happens in our current system. So I think just when it comes to discussing any alternatives, we need to be fair about how we compare them to the current systems.
Yeah, for
Nothing
sure.
will ever be perfect. Crime will always exist in some capacity or another. But when we talk about alternatives, right, imagining a post-policing world, there's two aspects to it. The first is crime prevention. So policing is a systematic issue. Crime is a systematic issue. You're more likely to commit a theft if you are lacking in some resource. If you need something, then you will steal it if there's no other course of action for you. Our current system of wealth inequality as a central foundation for maintaining our system as it is, that incentivizes people to commit acts of thievery.
Yeah, and if I could just butt in over there
Go
and
for
just
it.
say that, like, the way the policing is unfolded in society right now, right, it doesn't really address the social issues that causes crime to begin with.
Yeah.
They just point at someone and go, oh, thief, bad, lock him away. And that's that.
Yeah.
Like, it's not gonna dig into the reasons as to why that person chose to steal or the social factors that drove him to steal. They're just gonna point at that man and just lock him away.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So before we move on, I'd just like to introduce our friend Chelsea, who's just joined us.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Chelsea.
I have found a very weird kind of similarity between the current far left and far right in terms of hating liberal media. And I think I have that problem with liberal media as well, is when you mention that, oh, that person is a thief, and we just label them as a thief without really going into the context. A lot of the people from the far right and the far left point out that once the liberal media point out that, this person stole, usually the wider population just takes it in without really diving into the whole story. Because we believe the news to be correct and right all the time. And I kind of see the frustration of, well, far right. I'm not saying I understand why they're angry, but I think that they have a point in saying liberal media just sensationalizes things without...
Yeah, for sure.
going into the depths of it.
I guess more than just sensationalizing it, they play a role in normalizing it,
Yeah.
in the very least. Their whole approach to it all is just so dismissive. I fucking hate that.
It's because it has to be, right? Like, you cannot do a proper systematic analysis from a liberal perspective. So, like,
because
I think
it
about
is a liberal system.
yeah, I think about Trump a lot, right? Like, of course, everyone thinks about Trump a lot. And the discourse around the Trump election after Trump won, the liberal media refuses to accept that Trump talked true to the working classes of the states. Trump talked about their economic injustices. He talked about how he was going to resolve it.
Mm-hmm.
All they want to talk about is how he's like a dumb idiot Cheeto, and Russia did it. And that's it. And for 4 years, the headlines are just this Russia theory over and over again. There will never be any information that you hear about Russia and Trump that will provide any actual knowledge to you, that has any value in our politics. Because Russia is always interfering in the American elections, the way the Americans
like
are always interfering in everyone's elections.
Exactly.
That's not why Trump is president. He's president because he spoke true to the concerns of the working class, even though he did it from a perspective that leads to more injustice for the working class. I think like the similarity between like a far left and a far right perspective, there's an argument people make where it's like, oh, the far left is the far right. People who want trans rights are the same as neo-Nazis. That's a ridiculous idea. But it's totally true that we on the left can find more similarity with conservatives than we can with liberals because we speak true to the same concerns. Their approaches to solving it are very different from ours, and a lot of those come from values which I find like reprehensible and detestable.
Exactly.
But a lot of them don't know the alternatives because all they hear is their perspective and the liberal perspective and no other alternative. There's no leftist discourse to them. So it's either we can solve a problem from a rightist, conservative, far-right perspective, or we can do what the liberals are doing, which hasn't worked.
Which is why Bernie spoke so well in 2016 elections, because he was giving, before that, he was an independent socialist who didn't have enough of a voice, but when he came into the race, he gave a voice to that other alternative that you're talking about. But then the Democratic Party itself now admits that they maintained Hillary's power so that Hillary can still go forward
Yeah.
and not Bernie.
Like in terms of the demographics appeal of Trump and Sanders, they both appeal to the working class in a way Hillary would never did and never will. Just because they weren't puppets of neoliberalism like Hillary was. I sort of want to tie this conversation back to policing, right? Just wanted to talk about how liberalism will never address the issues of policing because, as we've already established, it indeed benefits off of it, as the police force just serve the role of the protectors of private property and capital. I think this creates the need of an alternative system, one which isn't built on coercive hierarchical exploitation as we see in capitalism or liberalism or whatever the fuck you want to call it. See, I want to build a case of anarchy, and when I say anarchy, I don't mean like skinheads waving Molotov cocktails and just like blowing up the parliament. See, when I say anarchy, I mean a society without classes, a society without exploitations, where hierarchies may exist, but they will be consent-based and they will not be violent. There will not be an enforcer in the form of a racist police force who are gonna disproportionately target black communities and minorities. Like, there are so many other ways to approach the issue of crime.
I mean, the first thing to do, right, like, the reason that liberals will never be able to solve the policing issue is that crime is a systematic issue, right? Like, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but the situation that you live in incentivizes your actions. If you come from a place of disparity, if you come from a place where you don't have like the fundamental resources to live and your only course of action is to steal, then that is the course of action you're going to take. Policing doesn't reduce the risk of that. It reduces the likelihood of you doing something so blatant you get caught. So it doesn't make you less likely to do crime. It makes you more likely to do crime in a clever capacity. Filling up a town that has a theft problem with police is not going to reduce the theft rates because it's not really dealing with the systematic issues, right? So when it comes to redoing the police and redoing the whole legal system, because effectively you'd have to redo all of the legal system, there needs to be a big focus on what happens before crime, the prevention of the actual crime through a systematic approach of dealing with what are the social factors, the economic factors that cause people to feel the need to commit crime in the first place. How do we reduce the risk of that occurring at all? And that's the ideal situation that we aim for with an anarchist society, is the removal of those unjust disparities and differences between us that incentivize these things from happening. But to whatever extent you can't mitigate it, right? Because I think there will be crime that occurs. Of course, there'll be crime that occurs under an anarchist state as well. Or like, I guess you can't say anarchist state. That's a,
it's a bit of a
but under anarchism, there will still be crime. But we need to deal with it in a less like religious punishment based, you've committed a crime, you're going to hell kind of capacity. There has to be a rehabilitation to it. There has to be a reconciliation to it. There have been many different approaches to community-based security that are not the police. And when you look at situations like South Africa during the apartheid, right, the police were not protectors of the citizens, they were enforcers of apartheid. So if you lived in a black community in South Africa, you could not rely on the police. So what you see popping up are these community-based, voluntary community security organizations that appear, right? People who work together and they agree upon the safety of the community and they agree upon the best course of action to do that. So if you're in a city that has a bad crime problem, instead of having more police come in to take care of it, a community-based focus where you discuss what leads to these crimes occurring in the first place, how to remove them, how to tackle them first before going into punishment, that is more effective at dealing with crime than a police system.
And that just appeals to me so much more. Like the fact, if I knew for a fact that my neighbor's out there protecting me at night instead of like some bootlicking cop who is probably racist and wouldn't hesitate to like knee me to death. Yeah. I would much rather have the alternative. And because it's consent based, I wouldn't feel oppressed. I wouldn't feel the fear that we were talking about when we said that we feel when we see cops out there, right?
Okay, but I do have a point, and again, I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Yep.
When you look into American Second Amendment as the right to bear arms, the whole idea was so that the state wouldn't be able to control you so much, and you can have a revolution to protect yourself if in need. And you guys are kind of giving me the same kind of, I guess, argument that, we're going anti-state, we're going anti-institution.
I feel like when bringing up the Second Amendment, it's already such a politicized topic, gun control and stuff. But when you talk about the Second Amendment, right, this is something that, right-wing politicians are defending, and so it's sort of like, if the government is defending the Second Amendment, right, then is it really for the people anymore?
So that's the question. So how do you, if you have an alternative from this example, how do you suggest something that the government then wouldn't use pro-state and then turn people against each other like they're doing with gun control rights?
Gosh, well, you see, that's a difficult one to answer. I guess Ray will probably have more to say on it, right?
Yeah.
Because that depends on what you view as a government and a state in an anarchist society.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm a communitarian-focused person, so I don't believe in having a federal governing body at all. Rather, like local councils, local municipalities taking care of things. There wouldn't be a government that you have to defeat because of their tyranny. So it's difficult because it depends on your perception of government and state. Did you want to add anything, Ray?
Yeah, I think it's interesting when I see Americans talk about the Constitution and them sort of jerking off to the Constitution, a document which was written over 200 years ago by slave owners and who were so actively sexist and racist. And the fact that that is the governing principle of America is should we even be surprised that the system that emerges from it is so problematic? Right? So what I'd say, Zarin, and to what you added as well, Chelsea, is that fuck the Second Amendment and fuck the Constitution.
Yep.
Blow it all away and let's restart all over
Yep.
from bottom up. Take a bottom up approach where the community, we take a more communitarian approach where we all come into it, where we all consent to it, where no one's a slave and everyone has an equal say in the institutions that we build, right?
Yeah.
Equality in the truest sense can only emerge if we're coming from a place of equity and not coming from a place where there are institutionalized hierarchies and differences between us.
I think something as well to say, and this is a tangent but kind of loosely related, is we talk about our ideals and what we kind of envision as the best for society. I remember as I was discovering the left and what that process was like for me. It was a process of compromise to start off with a lot of like, what's the most realistic outcome I can pick to fight for so I can just end up at the most realistic outcome. And when you do that, you're always just holding yourself back from actually understanding your values, your politics. You don't know how to perform in the real world if you're always thinking in terms of compromise with reality. It's super important to have an ideal version of the future based on the values that you espouse. And you're just constantly fighting for that ideal because you'll end up at a compromise most likely. But if you start off on a compromise, you're never going to get anywhere. That's how we have the American system as it is today. Everyone's just fighting to see who can compromise the best, and no one gets anywhere from it.
But you know what? I would counter that move by saying that America, on principle, at least when it was established, right? It was established on a liberal revolution against the monarchy.
Yeah.
It was so idealistic, and it worked for them. So I don't understand why we can't have a similar uprising and revolution and start over with a similar idealistic society which is more compatible with the times that we have today.
I think that starting over, to talk again about reform and revolution, I think, to say like we can have a revolution and then end up on an ideal society, just as likely as us reforming the system from within itself to be an ideal system. That's not going to happen. We've seen that not happen.
And like history has shown us that the only way change can truly come is through radical change.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to be, like change will never be top down because the status quo has no incentive to change a system that benefits them.
Totally.
Change has to be bottom up. That's the only way we can achieve some sort of equity in the society.
Interestingly, the American Revolution was hedged a lot on the oppression of police forces, like the role of the military as a policing force from the British government on the American people. That was a big spark of the American Revolution. So who knows what's happening in Minnesota? Maybe you'll get some real change out of it. But that's the only way to get real change in the States.
Look at the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah.
That was, in today's money, like $1.7 million worth of damaged tea, and that people were doing it to protest the British. And now that it's happening in Minnesota, with predominantly the Black Lives Matter movement. Now it's nobody can see the parallels. I agree. Radical change needs to happen. It can only happen from the bottom up, and it has to be revolutionary. And the fact is, like right now, I think we've transcended sort of non-violence, because how are people meant to keep watching other people or their communities get murdered by people who are supposed to protect them, and the government and Trump expects a non-violent approach? Yeah,
like when the system is so inherently violent against us, where will pacifism get us, right?
Yeah.
Pacifism will just, like, we can't breathe under pacifism.
A better question is, where has pacifism gotten us? Because that's what we've been doing. It hasn't gotten us anywhere. I think people try to bastardize a lot of historical figures that have had a real big impact by making them seem like Martin Luther King. Like, he advocated for active and direct action in a revolution. He wasn't like, let's do nothing and like sit and wait for them to fix our democracy. But that's kind of how he's been painted by liberal media, as like he's a perfect pacifist type. But that's not what it was about. Gandhi. Yeah. The liberals do like to take revolutionary history and make it seem like you can do things in a pacifist, non-violent, non-direct way. It's never worked, and we can see that in our history. We should be more scientific going forward. We should know that this has never worked. We shouldn't be so shocked when people choose an alternative now.
If anything, I feel like pacification in terms of like constitutional pacification can be seen as a real detriment to society, because if you look at the American Constitution, it prioritizing and safeguarding the interests of straight white men who own land, and when it was drafted, who own slaves. And if that is the basis that America is founded on, white men are still going to be pacified, and the pacification of straight white cis males is going to continue under the guise of the subordination of black people, and that's fucked inherently.
Yeah, all these points that we're making just shows why you can't really reform a system that is rotten at its very core, because reform just means you're willing to work within the structures of this fucked up system, and like the only way you can change these structures if you work beyond the structures that it grants you.
Yeah.
right? So go out there and riot, fucking loot Target. I will, like, there's solidarity.
Especially loot Target, especially destroy McDonald's, because they're corporations
Yeah.
and they're not losing much.
They're not, yeah. There's no equivalency. It's ridiculous. The loss of McDonald's is not equivalent to the loss. You cannot equate the loss of property to the loss of a person's life.
Exactly.
There's no line there. And like you said, the Boston Tea Party is a destruction of property in order to get in the face of tyranny. That is the premise that nation is built on, and they are fucking hypocritical about it all the
But dude,
time.
that's the reality in capitalism, really, right? Like, private capital will always be worth a lot more than that of an individual.
Yeah.
Because an individual is expandable, and there's so many of us out there. So what if, like, we kill some of these? There'll be other to replace it.
You see that in the way they treat the coronavirus in the States. They don't really care about the amount of people lost because they have a huge surplus of unused labor in the homeless population that they refuse to house. You can kill as many people as you want. There will always be workers to replace them. They don't give a shit about pausing their economy for a few months to save lives. Well, that was a hectic and powerful episode.
And I guess there wasn't really a lot of structure in what we discussed today. And that was just because I think today's episode was mainly fueled by our anger at the system. And it's just so much frustration. And like, I mean, my heart just breaks when I think of the families of the people who just get killed in police brutality. And just the brutality of the system and how like shitty the system is to so many of the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Zarin and Chelsea for being a part of today's podcast.
Yep.
It wasn't planned, but I'm really glad the two of you are here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks guys for coming. Thank you everyone for listening. Before we wrap up, I just want to acknowledge the original custodians, the traditional custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people. We are recording on the Kulin Nation. This has been the Azad Project. I'm Moo.
And I'm Rayan.